Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Price from the University of South Carolina. And on behalf of myself and Melissa Martiros from Anna Maria College, we're very happy to welcome you to this session on adapting communication and managing behavior in the music lesson. Originally, we had submitted two proposals to MTNA, one on adapting communication for students who have special needs or need adaptive pedagogy, and on managing behavior. And MTNA asked us to merge those two, and we're happy to do so today. So I'll be spending time with you at the beginning of this session talking about how to adapt a communication for students, and Melissa will join you a little bit later to talk about managing behavior in the music lesson. So before we begin, I'd just like to read this slide for you. Students communicate in a myriad of ways. We will discuss the complexities of verbal and nonverbal communication for special learners and how to communicate effectively to manage or avoid challenging behavior during the instructional process. For my portion of the workshop, I would like to talk about all the different facets of how we communicate and how we need to be aware of those so that we can communicate effectively with people who may communicate differently, and conversely, how we can observe them and learn how they may be communicating with us differently so we can have truly a two-way street in communication. And I know these days it's very common for us to use terms that may seem ableist in many ways, but anything that is said in this session is not ableist or or negative in any way. We have to use some terms that help us to quantify and codify things so that we can talk about them in ways that will be productive for all of us in the learning situation. If you look at the side of this slide, this is one of my favorite quotes that comes from Melissa, and that is, all behavior is communication. And I think that's very true. Many of our students who need adaptive pedagogy or who are special learners may have different communication skills than what we are used to in a traditional piano lesson. In their verbal communication, they may have a different vocabulary than what we assume. They may have a different number of words that they use, which may be less or more than the words that we use. They may have a different understanding of some of those words and how they are used in context. They may also find metaphors and analogies meaningless, counterproductive, or just irrelevant in much of our teaching. And if you think about traditional piano teaching, we use a lot of images, we use a lot of analogies, we use a lot of metaphors with our students. And those are abstract concepts which sometimes do not have a connection for some of our students to what they're actually doing at the keyboard. And in everyday communication, we use a lot of slang and we use a lot of pulp culture references that our students may not understand because they may not engage in the same types of social communication that you or I do, and they may not watch the same television shows or the same videos or the same YouTube or TikTok that the rest of us do. So they may not share some of those same communication devices that we use in everyday society. One of my favorite sayings is, when I'm teaching a student with autism, I need to say what I mean and mean what I say. And if you think about everyday communication, oftentimes we will use facial expressions, we will use slang, pop culture references, or we will begin to discuss something with another person and we'll see through their nonverbal communication that they understand what we're saying, and we may drop that subject and move on to another one, or not finish our sentences because we see that the other person is understanding us. But with our students with autism and other students who need adaptive communication, we need to finish our sentences and we need to say exactly what we mean and mean exactly what we say. And I like to use a process of say, do, say, do. Say one thing, do that thing. Say another thing, do that thing. Say a third thing, do that thing. rather than giving my student lots of long chains of information that they have to process, understand, and then execute in physical ways at the keyboard. So those are some of the differences in verbal communication. Now, some of our students may be nonverbal, they may not speak. So again, that's a limited vocabulary, but just because they don't speak in that vocabulary doesn't mean that they don't understand many of the words that we are saying and understand those words in context. So I need to observe my students very carefully and observe their nonverbal communication so that I know that what I'm trying to instruct with them is truly a two-way street in communication, and they really do understand this process that we're involved in, or this skill that we're teaching, or this routine that is unfolding during the instructional process. And nonverbal communication involves a lot of things. It involves our breathing, it involves our facial expressions, it involves our body language, and we need to make sure that all of those things are consistent and that they line up so we aren't giving our student mixed signals in any way. And often some of our students will communicate using just non-vocabulary sounds. And sometimes those may have no meaning, but sometimes they may have a great deal of meaning. So we need to observe our student and learn what their communication style is. Now, believe it or not, I believe that a lesson environment is communication as well. And our lesson environment determines how a student is going to interact. Is my lesson environment friendly? Is my environment hostile in some way? Are there too many distractions? Or do I have distractions, but are they necessary distractions? Or am I going to have things like phones going off and computer emails pinging, and all of my students seeing those as distractions or triggers within the lesson? Is my lighting friendly? Are the sounds and other objects and placement of things in my studio, are those welcoming? I always want to observe my student and make sure that the environment I'm placing them in is conducive to the instructional process that is going to take place. And then lastly, here on this slide, I just like to talk about communication versus lecturing. And I find myself evaluating this constantly in my own teaching. Am I truly communicating with my student, or am I just doing an information dump and lecturing them and assuming that they are going to understand, process, and practice everything that I'm saying at home? So I want to make sure that I constantly have a communication channel open between myself and my student. And this involves breathing, facial expressions, body language, vocabulary, and that I am allowing them to communicate with me as well as me communicating with them. I find it very instructive in my own teaching when I'm deciding what is effective and what is not. I basically like to flip the situation and say that the student is the teacher and that I am the student, and I need to learn from them how they best communicate. So I guess this is a good segue into our next slide, which it talks a lot about my teacher persona or our teacher persona and how all of the nonverbal things we do are communication. And if we use them effectively, we can keep that two-way channel of communication open. We can also avoid misunderstandings, and we can also avoid triggers for behaviors that might not be welcome within the lesson. So I always want to be aware of my persona, and I want to adjust all of these things in myself as much as possible. And that doesn't mean changing who you are as a person. It just means watching the student, watching the learning process, and adjusting parts of my communication as necessary to fit what the student needs. And conversely, I want to read my students' persona and learn their nonverbal communication and how they proceed in their learning so that I can adjust my teaching routines to meet their needs. So let's talk about a few of these things briefly. And the first one I'd like to talk about is our breathing. So I am always keenly aware of my breathing in a lesson. Am I breathing quickly? Am I breathing slowly? Am I breathing shallow? Or am I breathing in a very deep way? Or am I using things like a gasp or a sigh? Because even before I speak one word, how I breathe is going to indicate things about my emotional state and about my intellectual state. And so I usually want to breathe fairly slowly and very calmly. And if something's going wrong in the lesson, this can also help me keep from panicking that I'm doing something wrong. But it also shows my student that everything is okay and that everything is proceeding normally and that they are okay and that we're going to have a good time in the music making. Now, conversely, I can observe their breathing as well. And if I see the breathing speeding up, I know that perhaps some anxiety is happening and I need to manage that within the lesson or create it or adjust the environment so that my student is experiencing less anxiety. If they're breathing deeply, I need to understand if they're just tired or if they are fully engaged in the process. So there's no cut and dried way to really measure someone's breathing other than to spend time with them and to get to know them and to learn how to use our respiration or our breathing as part of a teaching tool that clothes the vocabulary that we're going to say in a useful and meaningful way. Our next category is voice expression. You notice I haven't even said anything about vocabulary yet. And by voice expression, I mean the way we use our voice, the sound of it. Now that includes our range. Now I'm a baritone, and so all of us don't have a lot of control over the range of our voice. It just has a certain sound, but we can vary that sound to bring importance or to highlight words in sentences, or to highlight concepts, or to begin things or to end parts of the learning sequence, or to help our student manage behaviors as well. And also if we watch their voice expression, they can teach us things about what they're thinking. And often if they can't say that in vocabulary, how they use their voice is going to show us a lot of things. So I'm talking about voice range, talking about the pitch at which we speak, whether that is high or low. Also talking about the timbre of our voice, whether it's a little bit more nasal or whether it's a bit more breathy. And we can use those things to draw attention to parts of the learning sequence. Other things about voice expression would be the rhythm in which we speak, how we highlight certain clauses and phrases and groupings of words within our instruction to draw attention to them and to get our students' attention, and then also the cadence when we begin an instructional sentence and when we end it, and how much time we take in between. And as you listen to me talking right here, I'm using a lot of these things to try and highlight the points that I'm saying. And I've found often with many of my students with autism, if I start speaking in a very unusual way by using a rhythm, it's amazing how quickly they will turn to me and make eye contact and be fully engaged in what I'm doing. It's also a way, if I'm teaching triple meter or duple meter, I can start teaching in a rhythm, and I'm teaching them by the sound of my voice what they're going to be doing in music. Now, sometimes I've also found with a student with autism that there is so much communication just in the sound of our voice that has to be decoded that often it's too much for them. They either can't recognize the differences in how I'm expressing myself in my voice or how it's being used. So sometimes I will just flatten some of those devices a little bit and just take some of that information out of my vocal speaking so that it doesn't have to be decoded and processed. And as I was talking there, you can see that I flattened all of those elements of my vocal expression. I wasn't speaking in a monotone tone of voice. I just wasn't being as overt and dramatic in my vocal expression as I might be with a traditional student. So facial expression. Believe it or not, if you sort of sit in front of a mirror and talk on the phone and watch yourself as you're talking, you'll see that your scalp actually moves, your forehead moves, your eyebrows move. our cheeks move, our nose can actually move, and our mouth is smiling or it's frowning, or our lips are pursed, or they are open, or they are puckered. And all of these things, when we say a word, are expressing things about the vocabulary and giving it deeper meaning. So it's important to be very, very cognizant of those things when I'm teaching my students. I always make sure that my facial expressions match exactly what I'm trying to say in the vocabulary. And often again, sometimes if that's too much information that has to be uh, processed and decoded, then sometimes I leave some of that out as I'm teaching and I flatten my facial expression a little bit so it's not as dramatic and not as over the top as it might be with some other students. And with one of my students with autism, just because they aren't making eye contact with me doesn't mean that they aren't listening very intently. So sometimes the facial expression just isn't useful because they're not giving joint attention to that part of the communication process. Next is body language. How we clothe a vocabulary word has more depth if my head is turned to the side, if my torso moves forward, if I lift an arm, or if I use my hands, or if I change my seating position, or if I move my legs, or if I cross my legs. Also, moving my body into my students' personal space or staying out of my personal space or staying out of their personal space says a great deal about my communication and how I am clothing my vocabulary words in more or less importance. So I want to make sure that my body language is generally fairly quiet. And if I'm going to move, I move a little bit more slowly because I don't want things to be shocking or startling to my student. And then in many cases with my student, I have to learn a different body language because many of them may have deficits in gross motor skills or fine motor skills. And so they may use their bodies much differently than I will to communicate to me. Now, our next category is prompting. We often think of prompting as a vocal thing with vocabulary. Get ready, count off, turn to page 26. But also, prompting can be done with a finger. I can point to a key or a note on the music or a key on the keyboard. I can point to a finger. I can cover up part of the music that a student has already played so that if they make a mistake, they don't go back to the beginning. I can also move my fingers to help keep their peripheral vision focused on the music, or if they're having trouble tracking back and forth between the keyboard and the music, this movement of my fingers can also show them exactly where they need to go in the music. And I can also use two fingers to point to one thing and walk across the music, pointing to another one. And then I can also change my thumb and begin that process on the next line of music so I don't have to zigzag very carefully or quickly to the next space, causing my students some confusion. Now, a lot of our students will have anxiety issues, or they may have self-stimulation or stimming behaviors. And one of these might be scripting. And that may be where they have just vocalizations that they use over and over again to help alleviate their anxiety or to help to keep them focused, or for whatever reason they need them in the lesson. Sometimes these can be the scripts of TV shows, they can be commercials or phone numbers. Sometimes they may engage in echolalia, repeating what you say. And sometimes this can be just something that they do to help alleviate anxiety. Other times, they may actually be using someone else's words or the words of a TV show or the words of a commercial or something that you said to communicate back to you. And so I need to be aware of when my student is just stimming and when they are actually using some of this script to communicate something to me. And I have one student who often carries on conversations with his hand. And if he does that, I let him do it because I know it's a way that he's trying to do his best in the lesson. and a way that he's dealing with a lot of the emotional things that are going on in his world. And then oftentimes my students just need more time to listen, to focus, to settle into the learning situation. And I always sit back and wait for their cues, whether they are verbal or nonverbal, to let me know that they are ready to do a trial of the skill we were working on, or whether they are ready to begin something new, or if they need more time, or if they need to just get up and get some energy out and jump around the studio for a while. So I find my students' communication cues to be very important. And I keep a sort of a working file for each of my students where I actually write down cues that they have done. And I try to review those if it's a new student or if it's a student that I've had over time. I sort of get to know them well enough to know what their cues are. And then pacing. I like to watch the behavior of my students because behavior is communication, and see how quickly or how slowly they are moving in the lesson, how long it takes for them to achieve joint attention, how long it takes for them to give me a cue. And then I adjust my own teacher persona to slow down or to speed up as necessary in the lesson so that we can keep the two-way street and communication going. And that I'm not just doing an information dump or working too fast. Because some of our students may not be able to tell us if they understood or if they have everything under control. And sometimes children want so much to please us that they will say yes. And I always ask 3 or 4 times if they understand something, and I always make sure that they understand that if they don't, it is perfectly fine to say no, or I need a refresher, or do it again, or one more time. And I will do it 50 times in that lesson if we need to make sure that they understand it. And that is okay, and that is a safe thing to do. So with those few things said about nonverbal communication, let's move to verbal communication. When I'm teaching a student who has autism or other special needs, I always like to use this little silly acronym. It's the APT or APT acronym. And what this means is auditory processing, pacing, and time. Many of my students may have hearing delays. They may have visual delays or visual disabilities. They may have also auditory processing difficulties. So I want to make sure that I give them time to actually hear a word and process it in their mind. And I watch for those cues to see that they have heard that short phrase or that they understand that word that I said. And then in my own instruction, as I said a little bit earlier, I change the pacing of what I'm doing based upon the student and their energy level and their emotional state so that they can have a safe segment in their learning, which is more conducive to absorbing material and being able to reproduce it in sound at the piano. And then I just give them as much time as possible to execute that skill at the piano. Time to hear the word, time to process it, time to turn that into a physical movement that they need to do to produce sound at the piano. So if I use the APT acronym in my teaching, I like to feel that my student is more apt to learn. And that's all part of the communication process. In this situation, it has to do more with the linear unfolding of the instructional process in time that allows for effective communication within that unfolding of the process. I also want to make sure that part of our communication is that I have joint attention with my student. And for a student with autism, that doesn't always mean eye contact. It may mean sitting quietly. It may mean making eye contact. It may also mean turning ahead so that I know they're listening. And in some cases, our students may have trouble with their gross and fine motor skills. So for a student to watch my fingers while I play, I may need to give them extra time for them to actually focus their eyes and use their eye muscles and their neck muscles to turn their head and focus on my fingers. And so I may see this 3 or 4 times, or I may need to just give them extra time to focus on what I want them to see or hear or do. In my verbal communication, because many of my students may have auditory processing issues, I'm also very careful about clearly enunciating every letter in the words that I am saying, every vowel, every consonant, every sound, every syllable, and that I'm also very clear on the pronunciation of the word as well, and that I'm not throwing away the ends of words as we might do in everyday conversation, or that I'm not rushing through words, that I'm saying them in a way that can be very clearly heard, then processed, and then turned into a physical action. I also get to know my students very, very well, so I know their level of vocabulary, and then I make appropriate vocabulary choices. And I usually avoid analogies and metaphors and words that involve a lot of layers. And an example of that might be, let's take, for example, the word to. It can be spelled T-O, T-O-O, T-W-O, or it can be a numeral as well. And I want to make sure that if I am using that word, I'm very careful about how I'm choosing it and in what context. With some of my students, I could, if they're having trouble using their left hand or getting it ready to play something at the keyboard, and I say something like, well, you can use your left hand, right? What was the last thing my student heard? And I wonder why they're using their right hand instead of the left hand. So I need to be very careful to say, use your left hand, please. Other hand, if they keep trying to use the right. Words can be a minefield, as we all know. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we use a special vocabulary in music study. And so whenever I use a word with a student, I always want to be sure to teach the meaning of that word in music study or in general. And I never assume that my student understands the word or that they've even heard the word. And I make it clear to them that it's okay to tell me I know what that is. And then I can tell if they truly do by the context within which we're working. So I always teach the meaning of a word. If you think about it, many of our students with special needs, if I say the word key, what is a key to them? It's a car key, or it's a house key, or it's a key on the computer keyboard. I have to teach them that that word also means this wooden thing that's either white or black on the keyboard, and that's what key means. In abstract terms, we can also say that this word or this concept is key to understanding something deeper. And so I'm very careful about using these words and teaching exactly what they mean. And then I always teach the meaning of the words in context. So, if we talk about form in music, well, to most people, a form is something that you fill out with a pen. Or to some tradespeople, a form might be something that you pour concrete into. It's a little different to say that form is how this piece unfolds and how the pieces fit together. So I always want to teach the meaning of that word, that form is something that we use in music, and it means the parts of a composition and how they fit together. And I always do spend a lot of time teaching that to my students. Another example that I like to use is, if I say, oh, the other day I was having trouble with Chopin Opus 58 in the fourth movement, and I always seem to have a memory lapse when I get to that Neapolitan chord at the end of the first page. Now, that would mean nothing to anybody on the street who hasn't studied that piece or knows anything about that piece. But to all of you as pianists, you immediately know exactly what I'm talking about, and you're probably going to shake your head and go, yeah, was it the fingering, or was it the hand position, or was it the notes or the pedaling? And we have just bypassed all of these things that I'm talking about because we have a shared context. And then again, I wait for cues from my student, a nod of the head or a sigh, whatever it is that they use to communicate that they understand what I'm saying, or maybe the movement of a head or the movement of a hand. And then again, I also do a lot of pacing where I may speak a little bit differently, a little more slowly, and I may use more or less of those nonverbal communication devices with my student to clothe my vocabulary in more meaning than it would have if I just said the word without any extra expression. So using all those things, I can create a script for my student that will help me create a routine in their learning that will be a two-way street to communication and will also help me turn the learning process into a step-by-step process, which is more conducive to their being able to learn words, give joint attention, and execute those words in sound at the keyboard. And this is also not only my script, but it's also a script that they can use to communicate with me parts of the learning process that they haven't been able to grasp or that they haven't attended to. So here's just an example of that script. One of the first things I always want to do is open this segment of the learning and get joint attention with my student. And whatever that process is for you and your student, just make sure that they are paying attention. Then I've also always found that it's best to ask permission. Can we work on this page? Can we do a new piece? Can we work on right hand and left hand? Can we work on finger numbers, or are you ready? And if my student says yes, they are inviting me into the learning process. If they say no, I need to understand and figure out if they truly need more time to get centered and ready to learn, or is this just an avoidance tactic? And parents can often be very helpful with knowing when it's an avoidance tactic. And then I'll give them an overview and say, now we are going to work on your right hand finger numbers and giving each one a name or a label. And then I'm going to explain how that process is going to unfold. I would like for you to put your right hand on the fall board of the piano, spread your fingers out. I'm going to point to your finger number, tell you what the label is, and then I will ask you to tell me what the label is. And I explain step by step by step in very simple say-do vocabulary what the student is going to do. Then I may need to do a model or show them with my own hand how we are going to do that process. And then I begin the facilitation process of gradually having the student do trial after trial after trial and showing me that they can do the exercise and that they understand and have learned the labels for the finger numbers. Now let's say they get it wrong. I still celebrate that because they tried. And I may say, well, I'm not sure that that finger is number 2, but I am so glad that you tried and that you gave it a label. Can we try again? And can you call that this label? And then we do it again and again and again, as many times as possible. And I always am a big fan of using what I like to call the perpetual smile, which is not just my face smiling, but also my voice smiling all the time, so that my student knows that they are doing well. Even if they're making a mistake, they are trying and they are engaging in the process. Then I like to give a short review and, of course, practice expectations. And part of that communication process is what I like to call the 5-step plan. The first is notes, fingering, counting, breaking things down into small bits, and then playing them 5 times in a row perfectly. And that's how we learn a skill, and that's how they practice it at home. So I give very clear expectations for practice every day. Sometimes their parents will want them to practice at a certain time every day, and I think that's great. And clear expectations on how to practice. And then I ask the student, are you ready to stop doing finger numbers now? Do you know the labels? Will you do your best? Very good. We are done with finger numbers. Now, can we work on key names? So that my student is very clear that one segment in the lesson has ended and another learning segment is opening. And then I go through the same script again. So those are some of the, I guess, the script or the scaffolding that I use to facilitate attention. And for students with autism, if we have a clear breakdown in the step-by-step routine, and if they also know consistently how a lesson segment is going to unfold, we will have more of a two-way street in communication, And the students may also not experience some of the behavioral issues that may arise from time to time. So to end my part of the workshop, I'd just like to next share with you some reflective activities that you can do to observe your own communication and to observe the communication of your students, and to sort of review things like voice tone, body language, facial expressions, vocabulary choices, and how those things may be effective or may not be effective in creating this open communication process within the lesson. So you're welcome to stop the video right now and read these or take a screenshot. And then I will turn everything over to Melissa, who will give you a wonderful set of things that you can use to help manage behaviors in the lesson. Thank you very much.